Now to finish up World War II. Well, right after Pearl Harbor, the United States mobilized for war. The U.S. declared war on Japan, then deployed troops to the Pacific Ocean, and immediately began to rebuild their Pacific Fleet and expanded both the Navy and the Marine Corps. Now, after months of fighting, including the Battle of Coral Sea in the Pacific, the Battle of Midway took place in June of 1942. And this was really the turning point of the war in the Pacific, in the same way that D-Day was the turning point of the war in Western Europe, and Stalingrad was the turning point of the war in Eastern Europe. Midway was the turning point of the war in the Pacific. This is when the U.S. intercepted a Japanese message that the Japanese would attack the Pacific island of Midway, and the U.S. Navy was ready for them when they arrived because we had broken their code. And we were able to destroy 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and win a huge victory over the Japanese Navy. This crippled the Japanese military, and they never recovered. The strongest that Japan has ever been was the day before Midway. In August of 1942, just 2 months after Midway, the Americans and Japanese began fighting the Battle of Guadalcanal. And in this battle, which lasted 6 months, the U.S. Marine Corps invaded the island of Guadalcanal, which Japan had taken over, and fought the Japanese out of it. This was in the South Pacific. Tens of thousands of soldiers died, mostly Japanese. Afterwards, the Japanese, in fact, called this place the Island of Death. Now, as MacArthur and the Marines kept island hopping in the Pacific, the U.S. attacked Japan in another way. Lieutenant Jimmy Doolittle and his men carried out several bombings of Tokyo and other Japanese cities. In fact, these bombings killed more people than the atomic bombs did collectively at the end of the war. So the island hopping keeps happening. We get closer and closer to Japan, and then comes the Battle of Iwo Jima from February to March of 1945. This is where the iconic picture and statue of the Marines hoisting up the flag on the top of the mountain at Iwo Jima comes from. It's an iconic image of the 20th century and the iconic image of the Marine Corps. Iwo Jima was one of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, with 18,000 Japanese killed and 7,000 American soldiers killed. It was a very significant U.S. victory, and it was made famous with the picture that you see here. From Iwo Jima, the Allied forces then invaded the island of Okinawa. And as you see on the map there, we're getting very close to mainland Japan. Okinawa was and is very densely populated, and so any kind of battle on a densely populated island is going to lead to massive casualties. From April to June of 1945, this battle was fought. 12,000 Americans were killed, 77,000 Japanese soldiers were killed, and then most shocking of all, over 100,000 Japanese civilians were killed because they could not escape the fighting zones. This was the most devastating battle of the war in the Pacific. The Allies won, and the U.S. actually occupied Okinawa until 1972. Japan often used kamikaze attacks. This is when they would fly a plane into a building or a ship while still in the plane, committing suicide in the process, hoping that they would kill more people. And this really shows the fact that the Japanese culture at that time valued honor more than individual life. And in their mind, there was a lot more honor in dying in battle than in surrendering. This is why the Japanese would never surrender. They would literally fight to the last man in every single battle because they did not really value human life in the same way that many other cultures, including our own, did. And this made them a very difficult enemy to defeat because it didn't matter to them how many of their own men died as long as they never surrendered. So throughout these years of fighting in the Pacific, American scientists worked on the Manhattan Project, which was instituted by FDR. It was spearheaded by J. Robert Oppenheimer, and this was the project that developed the atomic bomb, where you split an atom and make an intense explosion that can level an entire city. It was only theoretical at the time, and then finally in 1945, when it was tested, we realized that such a superweapon actually was possible. But then on April 12th, 1945, FDR died, and his vice president, Harry S. Truman, became the president of the United States. And he learned about the Manhattan Project, learned that we had a super weapon that, if used, could level an entire city and kill tens of thousands of people in one blast. Well, this was a very difficult decision to make. Should we use such a deadly weapon knowing that would kill many innocent civilians? Was this the only way to go, or could we have gone about winning the war against Japan in another way? Well, the thing that convinced President Truman to drop the atomic bomb on Japan was his belief that the only other option was an invasion of Japan. And we knew that this would result in an estimated 100,000 U.S. soldiers dying and over 1 million Japanese people being killed. Also, now that Germany had been defeated, we had to look to the post-war world. And one thing we did not want was for Russia to be stronger than America in a post-war world, because Russia was intent on spreading communistic oppression globally. So Stalin's goal now was to defeat Japan before the US does, which would be dangerous because then Stalin would be able to determine the future of Japan and would likely make it communist. So the bottom line was that Japan needs to surrender unconditionally to the United States, and soon. Therefore, Truman made the decision to drop the atomic bomb, sent a warning to the Japanese to surrender because we had the super weapon. They refused to surrender. And so on August 6th, 1945, the U.S. dropped the atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. This killed 80,000 people in 1 second. Here you see the mushroom cloud on the left that resulted from the blast. If you look at the top picture, the left is an aerial view of Hiroshima before the bombing, and on the right, it's afterwards. It's completely swept clean, like the surface of the moon. Still, the Japanese did not surrender, so 3 days later, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb on the city of Nagasaki, the mushroom cloud of which you can see on the right, bottom, and after this, Japan surrendered, ending World War II. Now, the most shameful and tragic part of World War II was a genocide that took place during the war known as the Holocaust. In this genocide, approximately 6 million Jews and 5 million other, quote, undesirables were exterminated by the Nazis. It began on the night of November 9th to 10th, 1938, known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. And this is when Nazi troops attacked and destroyed thousands of Jewish homes, stores, businesses, and synagogues as a form of persecution. 30,000 Jews were rounded up, put on trains, and sent to the first concentration camps, and approximately 100 Jews were killed on this night. And the 100 deaths that resulted from this were the first deaths of what would become known as the Holocaust. Hitler called his plan the final solution to the Jewish question. In his mind, Jewish people were a plague who needed to be eradicated, and he wanted to destroy the Jewish race in order to provide what he called Lebensraum, or living space, for the Aryan race. And this was a genocide essentially of people who the Nazis considered to be inferior. One thing Hitler was trying to do was to hasten the pace of evolution. And he said that, Jews, along with disabled people and several other groups of people he considered to be inferior, were holding back the process of evolution, which could be hastened if we got rid of them and encouraged the, quote, superior people to procreate. Now, Hitler hated certain groups of people so much that he was willing to redirect his troops and supplies from Russia and France, where he was trying to win a war, to carry out this genocide during the war. He didn't want to wait until after the war. He was willing to risk losing the war in order to carry out this genocide. Here are a few of the heartbreaking pictures from the genocide. On the left, you have a group of Jews being rounded up by the Nazi secret police, the SS. On the top right, you have them loaded onto trains like cattle, and then on the bottom right, you have the entrance into Auschwitz, which was the most deadly concentration camp. At these camps, people were stripped of all their possessions and clothes. They were dressed in rags. They endured forced labor, starvation, exposure, and even torture. And then frequently they would be executed in large groups, either by mass shooting into a mass grave or by poison gas. Gas chambers were closed-off rooms that Jews were forced into before Nazis then locked the doors, shut off the lights, and filled the rooms with poison gas, which would kill hundreds of people in just a couple of minutes. Here's another picture of victims of the Holocaust here. You see they're basically in a chicken coop. Their food bowl is like a dog bowl that they use for their pillow, have very little clothing. You can see they are so malnourished because they're given hardly any food to eat. Here is an artifact from the Holocaust we found. It's a wedding ring. You can tell by the heart on it, the gold band. And you can tell the person was Jewish because of the Hebrew inscription on the inside of the ring. And to me, seeing something like this really puts into perspective that these vast numbers that we talk about, 6 million Jews, yeah, that's what happened, but when you just hear the number, it's difficult to really personalize it and really feel the pain that each one of those individuals was a person with a soul, with a family, and they are made in the image of God. They're infinitely precious in the eyes of God and should be in our eyes too. So you look at something like that and you know that this person probably had a spouse and children, never came back from the camps. And then you look at a picture like this with thousands of wedding rings like that were stripped from the victims of the Holocaust before they were killed. It really shows the magnitude of the horror and wickedness that took place during the Holocaust. There were hundreds of these death camps all over the Nazi Empire. You can see a map there of the major and minor camps all throughout. Some were larger than others. The two largest facilities were Treblinka and Auschwitz, both of which are in modern-day Poland. And at Auschwitz alone, 1 million people were killed. In fact, Poland experienced the largest population decline as far as the percentage of their population that was killed during World War II and the Holocaust. About 16% of all Polish people were killed during this time. So these camps were discovered by the Allies in 1944 and 1945 as they liberated Europe after D-Day and Stalingrad, as they pushed into the Nazi-occupied territory, both from the west and from the east. And most Allies did not know that this was going on while the war was happening. It was only afterwards, when we discovered these camps, that we truly realized what had happened. In fact, the Holocaust was hidden from most Germans as well. American generals, therefore, when they discovered these camps, they made German civilians tour these camps to show them what they had allowed to exist by them turning a blind eye and pretending not to be curious about what was happening in those suspicious prison camps. And this was really important that Eisenhower and Patton and others made the Germans see for themselves what had happened, because otherwise it's very likely that afterwards there would have been all of these anti-Semitic ideas like, oh, the Jews just made this up, that it didn't actually happen, and some people actually bizarrely still believe that today. Now, because of the suffering that the Jews went through, the United Nations established the Nation of Israel in 1948 to give those of Jewish heritage a homeland away from Europe where they could live in peace. During World War II, the U.S. military was still segregated. Nonetheless, black soldiers still accomplished a great deal. For example, the Tuskegee Airmen. This was a group of African-American fighter and bomber pilots who fought in World War II. They were known as the Red Tails by some, and some even called them the Red Tail Angels, because they would be escorts of other attack planes flown by white pilots, and they would never leave their side. They would always be there to protect them from enemy fire. Much of their fighting took place in North Africa, where they shot down hundreds of Axis planes. And the Tuskegee Airmen were one of the most skilled and most decorated units in the entire military. And it's very important that the Tuskegee Airmen succeeded, and they did. It's very important that they did because this was symbolic of the potential for all African Americans. And a lot of people who saw the Tuskegee Airmen kind of wanted them to lose. A bunch of white supremacists said, you know, black people don't have the courage or the skill to fight in war, and they wanted them to lose. So the fact that the Tuskegee Airmen not only didn't fail, but succeeded so spectacularly really paved the way for the military to become integrated, which it did just 3 years after the Second World War ended. What's really incredible to me is the fact that the Tuskegee Airmen were willing to risk their lives for their country, even though their country did not treat them as equals. During World War II, millions of factory jobs opened up, which boomed the economy. This attracted many African Americans to the North and to the West. About 1.5 million black people left the South during World War II in order to go to these factory jobs and serve their country in that way. In addition, about 1 million young black men left home to serve in the armed forces. And whether as soldiers or civilians, all still really faced continued discrimination and segregation, and yet they played a completely indispensable and completely necessary role in winning this war. Racial unrest in urban areas led to dozens of people dying in race riots during the war. Now, if you think during a war is when we need unity the most, and yet with black people moving to northern cities, they are coming into contact with a lot of white people who have never lived with black people before, and in the eyes of some whites, they are taking jobs that should go to white people. And so there are race riots being held and dozens of people dying, both in New York City and in Detroit during the summer of 1943. Civil rights leaders then encouraged African Americans to adopt the double V slogan, or double victory. They said we need a victory over fascism abroad and a victory for equality at home. Membership in the NAACP increased during the war, and another civil rights organization was formed called the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE. Now, in 1944, the Supreme Court gave African Americans a big victory in the case Smith versus Allwright, and this ruled that it was unconstitutional to deny membership in political parties to African Americans as a way of excluding them from voting in the primary. So this was a way that African Americans could now vote not just in general elections, but in primaries in order to have a say as to which candidates they want to be the nominees from each major party. World War II ended in 1945, and then in 1948, President Harry S. Truman desegregated the military. This was done because Truman believed it was right. It was done even during an election year. He was probably afraid of losing white Democrat voters in the South, but it didn't matter to him because he believed this was the right thing to do, especially after Black Americans had risked their lives, and many of them died in not one but two world wars to help America win. So this was the first time since Reconstruction that a president used the powers of his office to challenge racial discrimination in a legal sense. So World War II was a watershed moment, not just for the world at large, but for America in particular. So much changed coming off of the war.